It was the winter of 1841, when the winds off the Delaware River cut sharper than any blade, and the snow fell in heavy, muffled sheets across Salem County, New Jersey. Farmers had long grown used to the strange sounds of winter nights, the creak of frozen branches, the moan of wood in the cold, but this was different. On certain evenings, just after sundown, there would come a faint knock at the door. 3 gentle raps, almost hesitant, as though the visitor was unsure he had the right to be there at all. When the door opened, he would stand there, a boy, small enough to be mistaken for no more than 12 years old. His cheeks were pale from the frost, his eyes wide, almost glassy in the firelight spilling from the doorway. He wore clothes too thin for the weather, hand-me-downs that hung awkwardly from his tiny frame. And when he spoke, his voice trembled, but not just from the cold. "Please," he would say, "could I stay for a while?" Inside, seated by the hearth, the boy's presence unsettled the room. There was something off about him, though no one could quite say why. The lines of his face suggested a child, yet there was something in his gaze, a heaviness, a weight, that felt older. Much older. In hushed voices, families began to share the same unsettling observation: this boy never seemed to change. Some claimed they had first seen him years ago, exactly the same height, the same features, the same delicate, childlike hands. He did not grow taller. He did not grow older. Neighbors speculated in the way that only rural communities can, with a blend of concern and superstition. Some whispered that he was a changeling, switched at birth by something otherworldly. Others suspected a long illness, or a hidden deformity. A few, more skeptical, dismissed the talk as exaggeration. But those who looked closer, those who let him stay the night and watched him quietly, knew there was something deeply unusual about Joshua Bennett. And in an age when medical science could barely explain the common cold, no doctor, no minister, and no curious traveler could name the condition that kept this boy frozen in childhood for his entire life. This is his story, and the story of the baffled world he left behind. To understand Joshua Bennett's strange life, we must step into his world, the America of 1841. Salem County, New Jersey, lay nestled between winding rivers and sprawling farmland, its winters harsh and its summers humid. The air often smelled of wood smoke, salt marsh, and the faint sweetness of apple orchards. In the small townships, the people were mostly farmers, mill workers, and tradesmen, bound together by necessity as much as by friendship. News traveled slowly. The nearest major city, Philadelphia, was a day's journey away, longer if the roads were thick with snow or spring mud. A newspaper might carry stories from England or Washington, but more often, the news was word of a neighbor's harvest, a church marriage, or the arrival of a new baby. Medicine, in 1841, was a far cry from what we know today. The germ theory of disease had not yet been proven. Illnesses were often blamed on bad air or imbalances in the body's 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Doctors used leeches for fever, mercury for infections, and bloodletting for nearly everything else. If a child failed to grow, the medical explanation would be vague: perhaps arrested development, perhaps consumption of the constitution, words that gave the illusion of understanding but solved nothing. Most families relied on home remedies and the advice of midwives before they sought a physician. It was into this world that Joshua Bennett was born. His family, modest farmers, lived in a weather-beaten clapboard house with a stove in the kitchen and a single upstairs loft for sleeping. His parents, strong, practical people, had little in the way of wealth, but plenty in the way of community ties. Joshua Bennett came into the world on a frigid morning in December of 1841. His birth was ordinary in every way the midwife could observe: healthy lungs, a steady heartbeat, and a shock of dark hair plastered to his head. He weighed just under 7 pounds, and his parents swaddled him in a quilt sewn by his grandmother. In those first weeks, Joshua was no different from any other infant in Salem County. He cried for milk, slept in short bursts, and clung to his mother's finger with surprising strength. By spring, he had grown enough for his father to joke that he'd soon be helping with the potato planting. But somewhere around his first birthday, the change began. Or rather, the lack of change. Other children born that winter began toddling clumsily through their yards, their faces filling out, their limbs lengthening. Joshua, by contrast, remained small. His legs were thin, his arms delicate, his features still those of a much younger baby. At first, his parents brushed it off. Some children, after all, were simply late bloomers. But as the months passed, his growth slowed even further. By age 2, he still wore clothes meant for an infant. His head barely reached the height of the kitchen table, and when he stood beside his cousins, the difference was startling. There were other signs, too. His speech came haltingly, words sometimes mumbled or lost in the middle of a sentence. He tired easily, often curling up to nap in the middle of the day. And though his eyes were alert, they carried a far-off look, as if he were drifting somewhere between childlike wonder and an unspoken weariness. Concern crept into the Bennett household. His mother began measuring him against the doorframe every few months, marking the wood in pencil. The marks clustered together, barely an inch apart, year after year. They took him to the local physician, a man whose practice consisted mostly of treating fevers and delivering babies. He examined Joshua carefully. Lifting his chin, pressing a stethoscope to his tiny chest, listening for anything unusual. But after several minutes, the doctor straightened up and offered only a vague reassurance. "Some boys are just slow to grow," he said. "Give it time. Feed him well. He'll catch up." But he never did. By the time Joshua turned 3, the gap between his age and his size was undeniable. He remained scarcely bigger than a child of 18 months, his cheeks still soft and round, his voice high and fragile. Yet his birthday candles told another story: he was no longer a toddler. In a community as small as Salem County, nothing stayed secret for long. Neighbors who saw the Bennetts at church began to notice. At first, they whispered kindly, "Poor boy, he must be unwell." But as months turned into years, the tone shifted. They had all seen children with rickets, or fevers that stunted growth, but Joshua's case was different. He never seemed to change. Other boys born in the same year now ran across the fields, climbing fences, wrestling in the dust. Joshua could not keep up. His legs, though steady, were short and thin. He would follow the other children only so far before stopping to catch his breath, standing apart like a spectator in his own generation. His mother tried everything she could think of. She boiled bone broth, fed him milk fresh from the cow, and wrapped him in layers to keep out the winter chill. But the boy's body remained stubbornly fixed, as if some unseen hand had pressed pause on his growth. By the time he was 5, the rumors had reached beyond their township. At market days in nearby towns, strangers would glance at him and then look twice. Some asked questions directly: "How old is he, really?" Others preferred to speculate from a distance. The Bennetts, proud but weary, began to limit his public outings. They could not protect him from curiosity, but they could try to shield him from cruelty. Still, there were moments they could not control. One autumn, a traveling peddler stopped by their farm. Seeing Joshua, he smiled and said, "Ah, what a fine little lad. Just turned 2. His father's jaw tightened. "6, he replied. The peddler's smile faded. That night, Joshua asked why the man had looked so surprised. His parents exchanged a glance, the kind that holds 1,000 words unspoken, and told him only that some people didn't understand. But in the quiet hours, when Joshua slept, his mother traced those near-invisible marks on the doorframe and knew the truth: he was growing older, just not upward. By the late 1840s, Joshua Bennett had become more than just a quiet curiosity in Salem County. He was now a subject of fascination for outsiders. The story of the boy who never grew traveled on the lips of merchants, on the backs of letters carried by post riders, and eventually, into the columns of small-town newspapers. A brief piece in the West Jersey Pioneer described him as a boy of peculiar constitution, whose stature remains unaltered despite advancing years. There was no photograph, photography was still a novelty, but the words were enough to ignite public interest. Soon, strangers began arriving at the Bennett's modest farmhouse. Some were kind, bringing sweets or small toys. Others came with the clinical curiosity of men and women who treated human oddities as entertainment. These were the years when traveling, freak shows, and curiosity exhibitions were gaining popularity, and though the Bennetts refused to allow Joshua to be displayed, the offers came nonetheless. The most persistent visitors were doctors, or men calling themselves doctors, from neighboring counties and even Philadelphia. They examined Joshua with the tools of their trade, stethoscopes, tongue depressors, and a barrage of questions. One physician suggested that Joshua suffered from a withering of the vital glands, a phrase that sounded authoritative but meant little. Another claimed it was the result of a weakness in the generative force of the blood, a theory as vague as it was unhelpful. In truth, none of them knew. Endocrinology, the study of glands and hormones, was still decades from being understood. The pituitary gland, which today we know governs growth, was a mystery organ in 1841, barely mentioned in medical texts. Still, each visitor left with their own story to tell, and Joshua's legend grew with every retelling. He became a figure both pitied and marveled at, the perpetual child who walked among men. For Joshua, the attention was a mixed blessing. On some days, he enjoyed the company, especially when visitors brought books or played simple games. On others, he shrank from the probing stares and questions, retreating to the safety of the kitchen hearth. But whether he wanted it or not, his life had entered the public record. And in the eyes of the world, he was no longer simply Joshua Bennett, the Bennett's son, he was the boy who never grew. Joshua Bennett's life ended quietly, without the fanfare that had sometimes surrounded it. There was no grand obituary, no medical paper that solved the riddle of his existence. He passed as he had lived, small, fragile, and mysterious. For his family, the loss was deeply personal. To them, he had never been a curiosity, a headline, or a case study, he was simply Joshua, their son. The empty chair at the table, the silent marks on the doorframe where his growth had been measured, were the reminders they carried. For the doctors and onlookers who had met him, he remained a puzzle they could not solve. Even today, with the vast tools of modern medicine, we can only speculate, a rare pituitary disorder, a genetic mutation, or perhaps a condition that no longer even exists in our time. Without his remains,